Susan sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee as the morning sun filtered through the blinds. The house was quiet, a peaceful, typical start to the day. She glanced down at her phone, scrolling through emails and messages. Everything felt normal, predictable, until it wasn't. David's phone buzzed across the counter. She paused, her gaze landing on the screen, where a notification from an unfamiliar name read, "Emily, can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you, baby." Her heart stopped. The words on the screen burned into her mind. Who was Emily? The name was unfamiliar, and the message, so casual, so intimate, was a slap in the face. Susan's breath quickened, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. She hadn't meant to pry, but her hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching for David's phone. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she unlocked it. She didn't need to read more, but her eyes scanned the screen anyway, confirming her worst fear. David had been talking to this woman, this Emily, like they were more than just strangers. Susan set the phone down slowly, feeling a wave of nausea wash over her. She sat there for a moment, trying to catch her breath. Her mind raced, and a pit formed in her stomach. How long had this been going on? How much had she missed? David had always been distant lately, working late, becoming more secretive. She had chalked it up to stress at work, but now it all made sense. She stood up, a surge of anger and hurt threatening to overwhelm her. Without thinking, she walked toward the den where David was sitting, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in the kitchen. "David," she called out softly, trying to steady her voice. He looked up, surprised by the seriousness in her tone. "We need to talk." David's brow furrowed, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Susan's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. She held her ground. "Who is Emily?" For a moment, David didn't say anything. His face drained of color, and for a split second, Susan saw something she hadn't expected, guilt. She could see it in his eyes, and she knew then that the truth was just as painful as the betrayal itself. "Susan, I can explain," he stammered, his voice shaking. "It's not what you think." Susan clenched her fists, trying to keep calm. "What is it then, David?" Her voice barely above a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" David's eyes dropped to the floor. He couldn't meet her gaze. 6 months, he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry, Susan. It was a mistake. I never meant for it to happen." Susan felt the air leave her lungs. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of secret messages, of David betraying her trust. Her mind struggled to process the words, to understand how he could do this to her, to their family. 6 months, she repeated, her voice cracking. "And you never thought to tell me? You never thought to be honest?" David opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His apology, his remorse, they felt hollow, empty in the face of what he had done. The trust that once existed between them now felt shattered beyond repair. Susan stood there, frozen. The house, their home, felt like a foreign place. The man she had loved, trusted, built a life with, was now a stranger. And as much as she wanted to scream, to demand answers, she couldn't find the words. She turned away, walking out of the room without another word. She needed space. She needed to think. The weight of the moment was too much to bear, and as she left the room, she felt her world beginning to crumble. Hours passed. Susan lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Her mind raced. How could I not see it? The signs had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. She had trusted David so completely, but now, she felt foolish. Her world, once so predictable, had been turned upside down. David had tried to apologize, but his words couldn't undo what had been done. He had betrayed her, and the trust between them was broken. In the silence of the night, Susan wondered what would happen next. She couldn't stay in the same house with him, not now. Not when everything felt like a lie. But where would she go? What would she do? She had always believed in the strength of her marriage, but now, that foundation had cracked. The pain was overwhelming, but there was something else lurking beneath it, a sense of loss, not just for David, but for herself. She didn't recognize the woman she saw in the mirror anymore. She had spent years giving everything to her family, to her marriage, but in the end, she had lost sight of who she was. David's betrayal had changed everything, but it had also shown her something she had never fully acknowledged. She had neglected herself for far too long. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she couldn't keep living like this. She had to find a way to heal, to rebuild, to rediscover herself. And as the night stretched on, Susan made a promise to herself: she would no longer let the pain define her. She didn't know what that future looked like, but she would find a way to move forward, even if it meant walking away from everything she had known. The days after Susan's discovery felt like a blur. She barely slept, and when she did, the quiet whispers of her thoughts were loud enough to keep her awake. The truth of David's betrayal hung over her like a dark cloud, threatening to swallow everything in its path. She spent most of her time in the guest room, the space between her and David feeling insurmountable. He apologized, over and over, but his words felt like hollow promises. The warmth she had once felt when he held her now seemed so distant, so foreign. She couldn't look at him without seeing the man who had lied to her for months. David would leave for work, and Susan would stay behind, pacing around the house. It was her refuge, but it no longer felt like home. Every corner held memories of a life she no longer recognized. She tried to occupy her mind, keeping busy with trivial tasks, but her mind kept going back to one thing: how had she not seen it coming? She had trusted him completely, and now that trust was shattered, and with it, her sense of self. The children, Matt and Lily, noticed the tension, but Susan couldn't bring herself to explain. How do you tell your children that their father, the man who had always been the cornerstone of their world, had betrayed their family? The questions weighed heavily on her, and every time she saw their innocent faces, she felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't just been betrayed by David, she felt as though she had failed them too. For the first time in years, Susan felt lost. She didn't know who she was without her marriage. Every piece of her identity had been tied to David and their life together. But now, with the truth of his betrayal hanging over her, she realized she had neglected her own needs and desires. She had been so consumed with being a wife and mother that she had forgotten to nurture the woman inside of her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had spent years bending herself to fit into a mold that wasn't even her own. She had played the role of the perfect wife, the perfect mother, and in doing so, she had sacrificed parts of herself. She hadn't done it out of malice, but out of a deep love for her family. She had wanted to be everything for them. But now, she saw that in trying to be everything, she had lost herself. Susan began to spend more time with her mother, Carol, who had always been a pillar of strength in her life. Carol could see the pain in Susan's eyes, but she also saw something else: the beginnings of change. One evening, over a glass of wine in Carol's kitchen, Susan found herself breaking down in front of her mother. She had tried to keep it together, to hold on to the image of the strong, composed woman she had always been. But the truth was, she didn't know how to move forward. She felt like she was drowning in her emotions, unsure of who she was or what to do next. "I don't know who I am anymore," Susan confessed, wiping away her tears. "I don't even recognize the woman I've become." Carol's voice was soft, yet firm. "Susan, you've spent so much time taking care of others, David, the kids, everyone. But you've never taken time to care for yourself. You've neglected your own needs, your own dreams. It's not too late to find yourself again. You can rebuild your life, but you have to start by letting go of the guilt and the pain." Her mother's words stung at first, but deep down, Susan knew they were true. She had spent years trying to hold everything together, but now, everything was falling apart. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward healing. The next day, Susan decided to take a step she never thought she would. She signed up for therapy, something she had been avoiding for years. She had always prided herself on being strong enough to handle everything on her own, but now, she realized that strength meant asking for help when you needed it. In the therapist's office, Susan found herself opening up in ways she hadn't anticipated. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just talking about her marriage, she was talking about herself. Her hopes, her dreams, her regrets, and most importantly, her fears. "Who are you without David?" the therapist asked, and the question caught Susan off guard. She had never thought of it that way. She had always been David's wife, Matt and Lily's mother, but who was Susan? Who was the woman behind the titles? Susan paused, a lump forming in her throat. "I don't know," she whispered. The therapist nodded. "That's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now. But it's important to start asking those questions." The journey to finding yourself again begins with self-discovery. Susan began to make small changes. She started running again, something she hadn't done since before the kids were born. She picked up a book she had been meaning to read for years. She joined a local women's group and started to open up about her struggles, finding strength in the stories of others who had gone through similar experiences. Though the pain of the betrayal was still fresh, Susan felt a flicker of hope. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know where her life was headed, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was taking control. She was reclaiming the parts of herself that she had lost. That evening, Susan sat on the balcony of her mother's house, watching the sunset. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, and the air was cool against her skin. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was beginning to believe that she could create a future that was her own. The betrayal, the pain, and the loss were still there, but they no longer defined her. She was beginning to see that she could heal, that she could rebuild her life from the ashes. And most importantly, she could do it for herself. Susan stood in front of the mirror that morning, brushing her hair as she looked at herself, really looked at herself, for the first time in what felt like years. The reflection that stared back was familiar, but there was a distance in her eyes. A quiet, broken strength that had been buried beneath the weight of family obligations, work, and the life she had built with David. Now, all of that was crumbling around her. But something inside Susan had shifted. The past few weeks had been rough, but she was slowly coming to terms with the painful truth. She was learning to breathe again. The moment she had walked away from David, she realized she had to find herself again. It wasn't just about surviving the betrayal, it was about reclaiming the life she had lost while pouring everything into her marriage. Today was the first day she was going to take charge of her life. She had signed up for a yoga class at a nearby studio. She had always loved yoga but had let it slip away years ago, pushed aside for the demands of motherhood and her career. But today, it felt like a small but significant step in taking care of herself. As she walked into the class, she felt a flutter of nervousness. It had been a while since she'd done anything for herself. She felt disconnected from the woman she had once been, vibrant, independent, and self-assured. But as she unrolled the yoga mat and settled into the room, the calming atmosphere began to soothe her. She followed the instructor's voice, breathing in time with the movements, letting the quietness wash over her. The class was challenging, but for the first time in weeks, Susan felt at peace. There was no thinking about David's betrayal, no guilt about the fractured pieces of her marriage. In that moment, there was only the present, the sound of her breath and the stretch of her body. She could feel her mind slowing, her heart beginning to heal. When the class ended, she stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the last few weeks lift just a little. She had taken the first step toward rediscovering herself. Later that afternoon, Susan met her friend Emma for coffee. Emma had been one of her closest friends for years, and despite the distance that had grown between them over the past few months, she was there for Susan. Emma didn't pry, she just let Susan talk, which was exactly what she needed. "How are you really doing?" Emma asked, taking a sip of her latte. Susan hesitated for a moment, but then she let out a sigh. "It's hard. I'm still angry, and I'm still hurt, but I think I'm starting to move on. I'm doing things for me again, things I used to love." Emma smiled softly, her eyes filled with warmth. "I'm proud of you. You deserve that. And you know what? You'll be okay. You'll find your way, Susan." For the first time in a long while, Susan felt a spark of hope. Emma's words weren't just comforting, they were empowering. She wasn't going to let David's mistakes define her. She wasn't going to stay trapped in the pain of betrayal. She would move forward, even if it meant doing it alone. The next few days were a blur of small, but meaningful steps forward. Susan made time for herself in ways she hadn't in years. She returned to the gym, started cooking healthier meals for herself, and even began reading again, something she had put off for too long. There was a freedom in doing things for herself, without the constant worry of David's needs or her role as a wife and mother. One afternoon, Susan found herself at a bookstore, flipping through the pages of a book she had been eyeing for months. As she wandered through the aisles, she couldn't help but smile at the new sense of purpose she was starting to feel. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she was hopeful. She was beginning to remember who she was, outside of her marriage, outside of being a mother. She was Susan, a woman who deserved happiness, peace, and the chance to build a life she loved. Later that week, David tried to talk to her again. He had been calling, texting, but Susan wasn't ready to engage in any deep conversations. She wasn't ready to hear more apologies from him. She had heard enough. What she needed now was time, space, and the ability to process her emotions without him around. When David showed up at her door, standing there with his apologetic eyes, Susan took a deep breath. "David, I don't know what's going to happen between us. I need space to figure things out. Please respect that." His face dropped, the sorrow on his face evident, but Susan remained firm. She couldn't allow his presence to dictate her healing. She had been his partner for so long, but now, it was time to be her own partner. "I'm not ready to forgive you yet," she added quietly, but her voice was steady. "And I don't know if I ever will be." David nodded, and for the first time, Susan saw the weight of his own regret. He turned to leave without another word, and Susan closed the door behind him. For a moment, she just stood there breathing. It felt like the first time she had truly taken control. The pain was still there, but it was slowly becoming less overwhelming. She was healing, and she was starting to realize that she didn't need David's forgiveness to move on. She could find forgiveness within herself. That night, Susan went to bed earlier than usual, not because she was exhausted, but because she had made a promise to herself. She would continue this journey of healing, of rediscovering who she was, one step at a time. It wouldn't be easy, but she knew it would be worth it. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead was filled with challenges, but Susan was no longer afraid. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope, and that was enough to keep moving forward. Susan sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small notebook in her hands. It had been a week since she had asked David for space, a week filled with silence, introspection, and moments of quiet realization. The pain still lingered, but so did the determination to move forward. The betrayal had shaken her to the core, but Susan was starting to understand that she couldn't carry this burden forever. The weight of anger, resentment, and hurt was too much for one person to bear alone. That morning, Susan had woken up with a new clarity. The pain had been suffocating, and the anger that followed was even worse. But she realized something important: she couldn't keep holding on to the grudge. Forgiveness wasn't for David, it was for her. She stood up and walked over to the window, the sunlight filtering through the curtains, casting soft patterns across the floor. Susan closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. Forgiveness, she thought, isn't about letting someone else off the hook. It's about letting go of the pain that's holding you back. David's face, still full of regret, flashed in her mind. She had seen the remorse in his eyes when he apologized. But forgiveness wasn't just about his apology, it was about freeing herself from the anger and betrayal that had been poisoning her every thought. It wasn't an easy decision, and it didn't happen overnight. The following days were filled with moments of doubt and hesitation. Susan spent time reflecting on her own past mistakes, the things she had buried deep within herself. She realized that she had been so focused on David's infidelity that she had neglected the ways in which she, too, had contributed to the unraveling of their marriage. But forgiving didn't mean forgetting. She wasn't ready to open herself up to David completely. Not yet. The idea of forgiving him was terrifying, letting go of the anger, the hurt, the betrayal, but Susan knew she couldn't heal until she did. Forgiveness, she thought, is a way to heal yourself, not the other person. After a few days of quiet reflection, Susan decided it was time to face David. She didn't know what the future held for them, but she had come to understand that healing was something she had to do on her own terms. David came over later that afternoon. His presence in the doorway made her stomach twist, but she held her ground. He was still the same man who had betrayed her, but something had changed in her. Susan wasn't the same woman she was when she first found out. She had grown stronger, more self-aware, and in some ways, more forgiving. "Susan," David said softly as he stepped inside, his voice tentative. "I know you're still angry, and you have every right to be. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I just want to say that I'm sorry. For everything. I never meant to hurt you." Susan looked at him, her heart still aching, but there was something new in her that kept her steady. She had spent days angry, replaying every hurtful thing he had done, but now in this moment, she realized that carrying that anger was only keeping her tied to the past. "I'm not ready to forget, David," Susan said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm ready to forgive." David looked up at her, surprised. What do you mean? I'm letting go of the anger, she explained, her eyes meeting his. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to heal. I can't move forward if I keep holding on to this anger. I need to let it go. For a moment, there was silence. Then David stepped forward, his eyes filled with emotion. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful you're willing to give it. Susan nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle in her chest. The decision to forgive wasn't easy, but it was liberating. It was a step toward healing herself, toward taking back control of her life. The next few days were filled with small shifts. Susan began to feel lighter. It wasn't that the betrayal no longer hurt, but she could see beyond it now. The anger that had consumed her thoughts and dreams slowly faded, replaced by a quiet sense of resolve. She started making plans for her future, not just in terms of her relationship with David, but with her life in general. She began pursuing the things that brought her joy, volunteering at a local charity, working on personal projects she had long neglected, and reconnecting with friends. Susan realized that her worth didn't come from her relationship with David, it came from within herself. David continued to show remorse, but Susan kept her boundaries firm. She didn't need him to heal, she could heal on her own. As the weeks went by, Susan found herself growing more confident. She knew that forgiveness didn't mean a return to what had been. Forgiveness didn't mean rebuilding her life with David in the same way it had been before. But it meant she could let go of the anger that was holding her back, and in doing so, she could move forward, whether that meant with David or without him. One evening, while sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, Susan reflected on the progress she had made. The pain was still there, lingering in the background, but it no longer defined her. She was stronger now, more certain of who she was and what she wanted from life. In the quiet of the evening, Susan realized that forgiveness had given her the freedom to truly live again. It wasn't about forgetting or excusing David's actions, it was about releasing herself from the chains of resentment. And in doing so, she had set herself free. Susan stood in front of the mirror that morning, taking a deep breath. It had been months since she discovered David's affair, and though the pain still lingered, something within her had shifted. She had spent weeks alone, reflecting, healing, and learning to embrace her own strength. Now she was ready to take another step forward, a step into something new and uncertain, something she hadn't dared to consider for a long time, love. The idea of opening her heart again terrified her. She had loved and lost before, and the thought of being vulnerable again felt almost impossible. But Susan had come to understand something crucial in her journey toward healing. Love wasn't just about giving, it was also about receiving. She had spent years loving others without ever fully loving herself. Now she knew that in order to love someone else again, she first needed to love herself completely. It was on a chilly Saturday afternoon when Susan met Mark. Susan had decided to step outside her comfort zone. She had joined a local book club to make new friends and get involved in something outside of her usual routine. It was there that she met Mark, a man in his early 40s who had a quiet, gentle demeanor and a deep love for literature. At first, their conversations were simple, discussions about books, favorite authors, and mutual interests. Susan found herself looking forward to their weekly meetups, enjoying the ease with which they talked. It wasn't like the whirlwind romances she had seen in movies, but something about Mark felt different. He listened. He cared. And he didn't expect anything from her. One evening, after a particularly long book discussion, Mark suggested they grab coffee at a nearby cafe. The casual invitation felt lighthearted, but for Susan, it was a big deal. She hadn't been on a date since her separation from David, and the thought of being with someone new made her heart race. As they sat across from each other, sipping coffee, Susan found herself laughing more than she had in months. Mark wasn't pushy or overwhelming. He was simply himself, and that made Susan feel safe. There were no expectations, no pressure, just two people sharing a moment of connection. Over the next few weeks, their friendship deepened. Susan began to open up to Mark, telling him about her past, her heartbreak, and the difficult journey she had been on. Mark listened with genuine interest, never judging or rushing her. He made her feel heard, something Susan hadn't realized she missed so much. But even with all of this, Susan remained cautious. The scar from David's betrayal was still fresh, and though she found comfort in Mark's company, she wasn't ready to give her heart away again. One night, after a particularly good conversation about their hopes for the future, Mark looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I know we've been getting to know each other slowly, and I respect that. But I want you to know, Susan, that I'm here. Not just for the good moments, but for all of it. If you ever feel ready to take the next step, I'll be here. Susan felt a surge of emotions, fear, hope, and a sense of relief. She hadn't realized how much she had been longing for someone who would accept her, scars and all. But she wasn't ready to rush. She wasn't ready to throw herself back into a relationship, no matter how kind and understanding Mark was. I'm not sure I'm ready, Mark, Susan admitted, her voice steady but filled with vulnerability. I've been through a lot. I need to take it slow. But I do like spending time with you. I appreciate you more than I can say. Mark smiled, a gentle understanding in his eyes. There's no rush. I'm happy with where we are. We'll take it at your pace. In that moment, Susan realized that Mark wasn't asking her to fix herself or be something she wasn't. He was simply asking for a chance to be a part of her journey, whatever that might look like. Over the following months, Susan and Mark's connection deepened, but Susan never felt the need to rush into anything. She learned that love wasn't about timelines or expectations, it was about finding someone who respected you, your process, and your space. She also learned something else. Love wasn't just about romance. It was about building a foundation of trust and mutual respect. She began to realize that she could love Mark without losing herself in the process. She didn't need to give up her independence or her healing journey to be with someone. With Mark, she felt whole, not incomplete. Susan sat in her favorite chair one evening, looking out the window at the stars, reflecting on how far she had come. The anger and resentment that had once filled her were no longer dominant forces in her life. She had allowed herself to heal, and in doing so, she had opened herself to love again. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first discovered David's betrayal. She was stronger, more aware, and most importantly, she was ready to embrace whatever came next. One day, Mark took her hand gently, his touch warm and comforting. Susan, I know you've been through a lot. But I want you to know, I'm here for the long haul. Whenever you feel ready, whenever you're ready to take that leap, I'll be here. Susan smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she realized something profound. Love wasn't just about falling head over heels. It was about finding someone who supported your growth, who understood your past, and who was willing to walk beside you, no matter how long it took. And with Mark, that was exactly what she had found. The rain fell softly against the window as Susan sat at her desk, a cup of tea in hand. It was late afternoon, and the quiet of the house was comforting. Her life had been through so many changes in the past year, and as she looked around at the room she had worked so hard to make her own, she couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. She was finally beginning to find her footing again. Her career, once a source of stress and uncertainty, was becoming something she truly enjoyed. After her separation from David, Susan had decided to pursue something that had always been a dream, working as a freelance writer and editor. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, she felt more confident in her ability to succeed on her own. Today had been a good day. She had finished a major project for a client and was feeling the kind of satisfaction that only comes from accomplishing something meaningful. It was a feeling she hadn't had in a long time, and she cherished it. As the sun began to set, Susan reflected on how far she had come since the devastation of David's betrayal. It seemed like a lifetime ago when she discovered his affair. The anger, the heartbreak, the confusion, it had all seemed so insurmountable. But now, it was just a chapter in her story. She had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, and now, she could see the beginnings of a life she had always wanted but never truly allowed herself to have. Susan's phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Mark. How about dinner tonight? I know a great new place in town. What do you say? A smile tugged at Susan's lips. Mark had become an important part of her life, and although they had been taking things slowly, she could sense that their connection was deepening. He was kind, patient, and respectful of her boundaries, and for the first time in a long while, Susan felt like she could truly be herself around him. She had started to see that love wasn't something she had to rush into or make fit into some idealized version of her past. It was something she could build with someone who respected her as she was, someone who was willing to take the time to understand her, not try to fix her. She typed a quick reply. Sounds perfect. I'll meet you there at 7. That evening, as Susan prepared for her dinner with Mark, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She had spent so much time thinking about what she had lost, but But now, she was starting to focus on what she had gained. She had found her strength again. She had learned to prioritize herself, to set boundaries, and to be unapologetic about her needs. She was no longer the woman who relied on her husband for validation. She was Susan, strong, independent, and open to new possibilities. As she arrived at the restaurant, Mark was already there, waiting with a warm smile. They shared a hug, and Susan could feel the comfort of his embrace. She felt seen and appreciated, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the weight of her past hanging over her. Over dinner, they talked about everything and nothing: books they were reading, places they wanted to visit, their favorite childhood memories. It was effortless, and for the first time in ages, Susan felt like she could relax and simply enjoy the moment. She wasn't thinking about David, or the betrayal, or the years of pain she had endured. She was living in the present, with someone who made her feel good about herself, just as she was. As the evening came to a close, Mark walked her to her car. "I'm really glad we did this," he said, his voice warm. "It's been nice to spend some time with you outside of our usual routine." Susan smiled, her heart swelling with a new kind of hope. "Me too, Mark. I really enjoy our time together." Later that night, as Susan lay in bed, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The past was still there, lurking in the background, but it no longer had the power to consume her. She had worked hard to rebuild her life, and now for the first time, she felt like she was moving forward with purpose. She didn't know what the future held with Mark, or where their relationship would go, but she was no longer afraid of it. She was learning to let go of the fear of being hurt again, because she knew that no matter what happened, she was strong enough to handle it. She had faced her pain, worked through it, and come out the other side with a clearer sense of who she was and what she wanted. The next day, as she worked on another writing project, Susan received an email from a potential client, one she had been hoping to hear from. It was an opportunity that could change the direction of her career, and as she read through the details, a feeling of excitement bubbled up inside her. This was what she had been working for. This was what rebuilding her life was all about. That evening, as she sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, Susan felt the cool breeze on her face and looked out at the city below. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing: she was no longer waiting for someone else to define her. She was creating her own path, and for the first time in a long while, she was excited to see where it would lead. The soft hum of the morning traffic outside filled the otherwise quiet apartment as Susan sipped her coffee, watching the city wake up. It had been several months since she had discovered David's betrayal, and now, as she sat at her kitchen table, the weight of the past felt lighter, though not entirely gone. It still lingered in the back of her mind, a shadow that threatened to creep back when she least expected it. But Susan had learned to breathe through it, to accept that the past was something she could not change, no matter how much she wished she could. She had spent so much time reflecting on what went wrong, what had been lost. But now, something was different. She was starting to look ahead. Today, Susan was going to meet with David. It was something she had been dreading and avoiding for weeks, an uncomfortable conversation that needed to happen. She knew it was time to address the things that had been left unsaid, to confront the past and, most importantly, to let it go. She was ready to move forward with her life, but first, she needed closure. The coffee shop was small and quiet when Susan arrived. David was already there, sitting at a corner table, his posture rigid, his face full of regret. Susan took a deep breath before walking over. "Hi," she said, her voice steady, though her heart beat loudly in her chest. "Hi," David responded, standing up quickly. His face softened when he saw her, but the guilt in his eyes was unmistakable. "Thanks for meeting me." Susan nodded, taking a seat across from him. There was so much she could say, so many things she wanted to scream at him, but she had learned that some conversations were better kept simple. She needed clarity, not chaos. "I'm glad you reached out," she said, "but I think we both know what this conversation is about." David nodded, and for the first time in months, there was no defensiveness in his posture. He had been truly broken by his actions. I need you to know how sorry I am, Susan. I can't tell you how much I regret what I did. I never wanted to hurt you." Susan took a deep breath. She had heard these words before. But today, she felt a different kind of strength inside her. The anger that had fueled her for so long was fading, replaced by something else, something lighter. She wasn't doing this for David. She was doing this for herself. "I'm not here to rehash the past, David. I can't keep carrying it with me. I've spent too long holding on to it, she said, her voice quiet but firm. It hurts. It always will. But I can't keep letting it define me. David looked down, guilt overwhelming his face. I understand, he said softly. I've hurt you beyond words, and I will never forgive myself for that. Susan's gaze softened, but she remained resolute. The only thing I can do now is let it go. For myself. For my peace of mind. But it doesn't mean that everything can go back to what it was. There was a long silence between them, but this time, it wasn't heavy with resentment. It was an understanding, a shared moment of quiet acceptance. David nodded slowly, looking as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. I understand, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I just want you to know that I'll always regret losing you. You were everything to me. Susan's heart ached, but she didn't feel the need to answer. This wasn't about making him feel better or worse. It was about her. This was her journey, and she was taking control of it. Later that day, Susan sat at her desk, staring out the window as the sky shifted from daylight to twilight. The conversation with David had gone better than she expected, but it still left her feeling drained. As much as she had wanted closure, she realized that the true closure had come from within her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had let go of the anger. The past was no longer a shackle, it was a chapter, a memory, but not the whole story of who she was. Susan was sitting in her favorite chair by the window when Mark texted her, asking if she wanted to grab dinner. She smiled, feeling a spark of warmth at the thought of him. She had been hesitant about her relationship with Mark, unsure if she was truly ready for something new. But over time, Mark had shown her what it felt like to be with someone who respected her, who was patient and kind. There was no rush, no pressure, just two people finding their way in a world that had already dealt them both their fair share of heartache. She texted him back, sounds great. I'll meet you at 7. As the evening approached, Susan realized that she had not just forgiven David, she had forgiven herself. She had carried so much guilt and anger, convinced that her worth was tied to her marriage and what had happened. But now, she understood. Her worth came from who she was, not from the mistakes of the past. Dinner with Mark that evening was simple but comfortable. They laughed over small things, shared stories, and enjoyed the kind of connection Susan hadn't known she needed. As they talked, she realized something. She wasn't looking for a perfect relationship. She wasn't looking for someone to replace the past. She was looking for someone who would stand beside her, who would support her growth and not try to fix what had been broken. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt lighter than she had in months. She had let go of the past. She had stopped letting it control her. The betrayal, the pain, the confusion, they were all a part of her story, but they no longer defined her. Susan knew the road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with where she was. She wasn't waiting for a miracle. She was living in the now, creating a future where she could heal, love, and thrive, on her own terms. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink as Susan sat in her favorite chair, sipping her evening tea. The quiet peace of the moment felt like the perfect reflection of where she was in life, calm, content, and ready to face whatever came next. Over the past several months, she had rebuilt her life. The pain of David's betrayal was no longer at the forefront of her mind. It had faded into the background, not forgotten, but no longer controlling her. She had worked hard to move past the hurt and was now starting to live for herself, not for anyone else. She looked out the window, the soft evening light casting shadows on the room. Her mind wandered to the possibilities ahead, the career she was building, the relationship she was nurturing, and the future that, for the first time in a long time, felt open and full of promise. The past year had been a journey of discovery, both painful and rewarding. Susan had been through the dark days of anger, sadness, and betrayal, but now, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons those experiences had taught her. She had learned to forgive, not just David, but herself. She had learned that her worth wasn't tied to her past or her relationship with David, it was intrinsic to who she was, and she had the power to shape her future. As Susan worked on her freelance writing career, she realized that her creativity, her passion for storytelling, was a key part of her healing. Writing allowed her to process her thoughts, to reclaim parts of herself she had lost along the way. It wasn't just a job, it was therapy, a lifeline, and a way to connect with her own voice again. She had also begun to explore other passions, volunteering at local organizations, reconnecting with friends, and making time for the hobbies she had once put aside. Each small step forward had reinforced her sense of self, helping her shed the weight of the past and step into the woman she had always wanted to be. Later that week, Mark called and suggested they take a weekend trip to the coast. It was a simple idea, but one that Susan hadn't considered in a long time. She had been so focused on rebuilding her life that she hadn't thought much about leisure, about joy. But now, as she thought about it, the idea of a peaceful weekend getaway felt exactly like what she needed: time to enjoy the present, to disconnect from work and the responsibilities that had weighed her down for so long. The weekend arrived, and Susan found herself standing at the edge of the water, the salty breeze tousling her hair as Mark stood beside her. The beach was nearly empty, the waves crashing softly against the shore, and the setting sun painted the sky in golden light. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Mark said, his voice gentle, pulling Susan from her thoughts. Susan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "It is. It's perfect." They spent the day walking along the shore, talking about everything and nothing. The relaxed pace of the weekend allowed Susan to truly be present in the moment. There were no pressures, no expectations. It was just them, two people enjoying life as it was. As they sat on the beach, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Susan realized that this was what she had been waiting for. Peace. A sense of contentment that didn't rely on external validation or the past. It was the freedom to simply be, and she was finally starting to embrace it. That evening, as they sat on the balcony of their rented cabin, watching the stars come out, Mark turned to her. "Susan," he began, his voice soft, "I know we've been taking things slow, and I want you to know I respect that. But I also want you to know that I'm here for you, whatever that looks like. I care about you, and I want to see where this goes. No pressure, just whatever feels right for you." Susan looked at him, feeling a sense of comfort in his words. She had been so afraid of jumping back into a relationship after everything that had happened, but with Mark, it felt different. He had never pushed her, never rushed her. He had simply been there, patiently, letting her heal at her own pace. "I care about you too, Mark," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I'm starting to think I'm ready for something more. But I'm also ready to make sure that whatever happens, it's because I want it, not because I feel like I have to." Mark smiled, his eyes filled with understanding. "I'm in no rush, Susan. Whatever you need, I'm here." The next morning, as they packed up to leave the beach, Susan felt a sense of renewal wash over her. This was a new chapter, not just with Mark, but with herself. She had come so far, and though she wasn't sure what the future held, she felt a sense of readiness, ready to embrace love again, ready to explore new possibilities, and most of all, ready to live life on her own terms. As they drove home, the city skyline slowly came into view, and Susan couldn't help but smile. Her life was hers to shape now, and she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the strength, confidence, and love she had rediscovered within herself. That evening, as Susan sat at her desk, finishing up another writing project, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had learned to trust herself again, to embrace the changes life had thrown her way, and to move forward with grace. The future was no longer something she feared, it was something she was eager to step into. As the clock ticked past midnight, Susan closed her laptop and stood up, stretching. She glanced out the window, the city lights twinkling below. It was a new beginning, and she was ready for it.